The hearing will come to order. I'd like to begin by thanking my ranking member, Senator Hagerty, and other members of the committee for our continued oversight efforts of agencies under our jurisdiction. We're very grateful to be joined today by the chair of the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, Jessica Rosenworcel. Welcome to you. The FCC has a very important set of responsibilities, from working to provide access to affordable high-speed internet to keeping spectrum licensing competitive and much more. The mission of the FCC is essential to ensuring that the United States remains on the cutting edge of communications technologies in the 21st century, and that in turn is essential to the success of our country, our economy, and important, of course, to national security. I'm pleased the Senate confirmed President Biden's nominee, Ana Gomez, to the commission earlier this month, bringing the FCC to its full contingent of 5 commissioners. And I'd like to applaud Chair Rosenworcel and the entire FCC team, including all the commissioners, for their rapid response to the disasters in Hawaii and Florida. Their work in the early days of the disaster helped save lives by ensuring that survivors could stay connected to their loved ones and to emergency response teams. Tragedies like this show us just how essential access to broadband is in our modern life. It's not a luxury, it's a necessity. And if we did not know that before the pandemic, we certainly know it now. America scrambled to get online, Zoom became a verb, and Congress worked through a number of measures to try to address these issues and get more Americans connected. Before the pandemic struck, I had introduced legislation to close what we called the homework gap, because students without access to broadband were put at a big disadvantage when doing their homework compared to their peers who were connected. But with the pandemic, the homework gap became a full-blown learning gap. As classes went online, students who were unconnected were bound to fall even further behind. Many states and local jurisdictions used the emergency school funding they had through the CARES bills to help their students connect with remote learning. But there was not a dedicated program until, as part of the American Rescue Plan, we established the Emergency Connectivity Fund, a critical lifeline to students around the country. And that Emergency Connectivity Fund has helped more than 18 million students connect to the internet by providing them with Wi-Fi hotspots, modems, routers, and internet-enabled devices, as well as internet service to those devices. This was an emergency measure, and its dedicated funding will run out in December, but it has established a strong foundation that we can build on by modernizing and adapting the E-rate program. We need to ensure that the E-rate program can provide connectivity beyond the walls of our classrooms and our libraries. And I know Chair Rosenworcel is passionate about this issue, and I salute you for your efforts. We must, of course, not only connect students to broadband, but every American household and small business, no matter where they live, in rural, suburban, and urban areas. Nationwide, tens of millions of Americans remain without access to broadband. But thanks to the passage of the Infrastructure Modernization Bill, we are well on our way to connecting them. That law launched and funded the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program, known as the BEAD program, to connect America. But the BEAD program and other internet connectivity programs would be flying blind if it were not for the FCC's broadband mapping program. For years, the FCC had a broken mapping system. Many Americans were told they were connected to the internet when in fact they were not. By creating an interactive system, the FCC has dramatically improved the mapping process so we can implement plans to connect all Americans. There are still issues, and we're working through them, but it's much better today than it was, much better. My home state of Maryland received nearly $268 million to expand access to affordable, reliable, high-speed broadband across our state. And the FCC's map is providing crucial data to aid in the implementation of that effort. But we all know that getting people physically connected to the internet won't do them any good if they cannot afford to pay the bill for services. That's why the Infrastructure Modernization Bill also launched the FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program. This program provides eligible low-income households with high-speed internet plans at little or no cost. In my home state of Maryland, over 255,000 households have already enrolled in ACP, and more than 20 million households in every part of the country have enrolled in the program, and enrollment is growing by the day. The Affordable Connectivity Program has been vital to ensuring equitable access to high-quality, modern broadband infrastructure, especially in rural areas and low and moderate income communities. And today, we will discuss the importance of providing ongoing support for that program. Turning to another area of FCC responsibility, it's been 6 months since the FCC's Spectrum Auction Authority has lapsed, the first time the FCC has not had this authority in over 30 years. This is on members of Congress to address, but we look forward to Chair Rosenworcel's comments on that matter. Colleagues, we need to quickly come to agreement so the FCC can conduct auctions that are necessary to ensure the United States remains on the cutting edge of global communications technology. It's important to our economy and our national security. Today's hearing will give us an opportunity to learn more about that and other issues and inform the work we are doing together on behalf of the American people. So with that, I will now turn to Senator Hagerty for his opening statement. Senator?
Well, thank you, Chairman Van Hollen, for holding this hearing. As the ranking member, I look forward to working with you on this subcommittee and with all of our staffs to continue to make certain that our tax dollars are spent effectively and efficiently. And Chairwoman Rosenworcel, welcome to you. It's been good to get to know you by phone. I'm glad to see you here today and looking forward to your testimony. As with the airwaves that are broadcasting this hearing, the FCC's influence on the economy, our national security, and daily routines of American life is paradoxically both ubiquitous and invisible. The FCC regulates the non-federal use of the electromagnetic spectrum that we rely upon for mundane activities like our garage door openers, all the way to the global delivery of events that shape the world and allow us to witness history as it unfolds in real time. And not just on television, but over mobile devices now. The FCC also regulates speech, specifically children's programming, campaign advertising, and indecency. But today, that's only for broadcasters. Whether the FCC should or should not, or to what degree, regulate the speech of social media platforms is currently under debate. Personally, I've introduced legislation, the 21st Century Free Speech Act, that would ensure that all Americans have reasonable, non-discriminatory access to big tech speech platforms. It would also limit the ability of big tech platforms to discriminate against free speech on ideological or political grounds. That's because I believe that Americans, rather than big tech companies, should determine what information to consume, what information to share, what information to believe. The FCC also, in coordination with other federal agencies, has a role in regulating communications equipment that may pose an unacceptable national security risk, which means the FCC can prohibit the sale or use of domestic or foreign-made equipment in the United States. We're in an information age that depends on reliable and secure data, video and voice transmissions, as well as reliable and secure networks and devices. We all experienced that firsthand during the pandemic, trying to work from home while sitting around the kitchen table with our children who were trying to attend classes remotely. The FCC's highest priority, according to its strategic plan, is to help bring affordable, reliable, high-speed broadband to 100% of the population. Once upon a time, back in the 1950s, the FCC's highest priority was to bring telephone service to 100% of the population. Telephones then, rotary ones, were considered a necessity that should be provided to all. The FCC has come close, but still hasn't achieved ubiquity on that. As technology changed, the definition of universal service has changed as well to encompass wireless service, and now it includes broadband. I'll also add that the definition of broadband has changed. At one point, it was the 10.1 standard. Now, it's 25.3, and in the future, it could be 120. In other words, as long as the definition and measure of universal service and broadband keeps changing, then the goal of 100% connectivity is practically unattainable. One thing, however, that has not changed, nor will it ever, is that resources are limited. The FCC relies on fees to pay for its operations. In federal budget parlance, these costs are offset, which is often mistaken for free. These costs are not free. They're ultimately paid by the consumer, and it's this subcommittee's prerogative and duty to limit these costs, which are growing. If the FCC's full budget request were enacted, then the FCC's cost will have grown by 26%, or 8% annually on average since FY21, excluding mandatory funding. As a former businessman, I want to see evidence of corresponding increase in output or productivity for that type of investment. Chairwoman Rosenworcel, I'm certain that you'll address these concerns today in your testimony. I look forward to hearing you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hagerty. We've been joined by Senator Kennedy, and now I'm going to turn it over to Chair Rosenworcel, and we'll not go through your long and very impressive biography, but just to say that the chair has over 2 decades of communications policy and public service experience, including as the Senior Communications Counsel for the United States Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. And with that, let me turn it over to you. If you could try to keep your opening statement to about 5 minutes, and then we'll take questions. Chair Rosenworcel.
Thank you. Chairman Van Hollen, Ranking Member Hagerty, Senator Kennedy, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and for providing full funding for the FCC in your fiscal year 2024 bill. As a fee-funded agency, the FCC has worked hard to develop a budget that maximizes benefits to consumers while remaining fair to those responsible for funding our requested appropriation. We do this because the work of the FCC matters. Communications technologies power 1/6 of the economy, and I believe everyone needs access to these technologies to have a fair shot at 21st century success. Although this is not my first hearing before this subcommittee, it is a first in other ways. It is my first presentation of the agency budget under my leadership, and the first time in our nation's history that a woman has permanently led the FCC. So let me draw attention to some of the recent efforts of the agency. First up, our Affordable Connectivity Program. It is the largest broadband affordability effort in the history of the United States. It now helps 21 million households get online and stay online. But for this program to continue to do this good work, we will need additional funds because support from the bipartisan infrastructure law will run out as early as April of next year. We've come too far to turn back. Keeping this program funded needs to be a priority. Of course, this program's not the only one to help get broadband to those who need it. I want to acknowledge that the Emergency Connectivity Fund, championed by Chairman Van Hollen, has also been instrumental in closing the digital divide, especially for students. Second, the FCC launched its Space Bureau. The space economy is growing fast, and the agency's satellite licensing policies need to keep up. I want to thank the subcommittee for supporting this reorganization. Third, we've modernized our regulatory fee structure to be more transparent and more fair. Fourth, we have developed the National Broadband Map. It is a detailed effort to identify where broadband is and is not all across the country. This effort is iterative. It is improving all the time. Fifth, we implemented the Pirate Act. The budget increase you provided has made it possible to enforce this law. Sixth, the FCC is working to connect the most vulnerable. We are implementing the Safe Connections Act to assist survivors of domestic violence. We are also implementing the Martha Wright Reed Just and Reasonable Communications Act to ensure that the rates for prison payphone calls are truly just and reasonable. On top of this, we took steps to ensure video conferencing services those that have become ubiquitous, like Zoom, Teams, and WebEx, are accessible to people with disabilities. Seventh, we are doubling down on our efforts to stop scam robocalls and robotexts. We have new technologies to cut them off and new legal procedures to stop carriers from sending along these scams. And our efforts are beginning to bear fruit. For instance, we were able to shut down a major auto warranty robocall scam, but we are going to need new tools from Congress to continue to keep this junk off the line. Eighth, we're connecting people to emergency services. We set up 988, the new 3-digit, easy-to-remember number to call or text the suicide and crisis hotline. Ninth, we are focused on network security. We've updated our rules to improve the reliability of wireless networks during disaster. And for the first time in history, we have revoked the authorization to provide telecommunications services for Chinese communications providers. We've also set up the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Reimbursement Program to remove and replace insecure equipment in our nation's networks. To fully fund this effort, we will need additional funds. And 10th, we are focused on spectrum policy. We are identifying airwaves in the 7 to 16 gigahertz band to ensure the United States leads in 5G, 6G, and beyond. We have also put a premium on ensuring spectrum reaches tribal communities. As a result of our work, today more than 80% of federally recognized tribes have access to licensed spectrum. But as we plan for the future, we need Congress to restore the FCC's spectrum auction authority. For 3 decades, the agency has had the power to auction airwaves for commercial use. During that time, we have held 100 auctions and raised $233 billion for the United States Treasury. Letting this authority lapse jeopardizes our wireless leadership and ability to compete in a global economy. Simply put, we need this authority back. Thank you again to the subcommittee for your support for the fiscal year 2024 bill, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm going to start where you left off on the issue of spectrum authority and just get your sense of what the harmful impact is to our economy, to our national security, to a whole range of issues because that authority has now lapsed. And if you could just provide your impressions about how we can best navigate a solution, which of course does need to come from Congress.
Thank you. The United States is a wireless leader. The smartphone started here. The application economy began on our shores. And we've powered this wireless revolution with spectrum. We've been able to take airwaves and repurpose them for new commercial use and hold commercial spectrum auctions. Those auctions have been a model for the world, and they've been lucrative for the United States Treasury. Like I just mentioned, we've raised $233 billion. But for the first time in 30 years, we don't have that authority. And this year's an especially important year because we are going to the World Radio Conference. That's a conference where global spectrum authorities gather every 4 years to discuss their plans for the wireless future. And in the United States, we now do not have the authority to hold commercial spectrum auctions, and we lack a commercial spectrum pipeline. So what I am concerned about is that the future won't look like the past, and our leadership is less secure than it should be.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Chair Rosenworcel. And just to my colleagues here, we've really got to resolve this. I mean, as you know, it expired in March, and we're just hurting our own country and our economy. So I hope we'll all figure out a way forward on this. If I could turn now to trying to connect all America to high-speed internet, and really ask you to focus on 2 programs that both you and I mentioned in our opening statements. One is the Affordable Connectivity Program. How many people are on it? How many people do you expect to join in the coming weeks? And what would be the consequences of Congress failing to provide additional funding for that program? And actually, I'll wait until you answer that one before I ask a second question.
All right, it gets complicated fast. The Affordable Connectivity Program is the largest broadband affordability effort in our nation's history. It is the byproduct of the bipartisan infrastructure law. The FCC runs it. It means low-income households in every state can get access to support for basic broadband service. It is helping 21 million households across the country get online and stay online. Right now, our best estimates is that the funding provided in that law will run out in April. And by April, we might have as many as 25 million households that are connected to this program. We have come so far, we can't stop now. We absolutely need another appropriation from Congress to continue the good work this program is doing. It has been of extraordinary benefit to people around the country who can now go to work, go to school, take health care appointments, and participate in their communities because they have reliable internet access.
Well, thank you. As you said, I think 24 million people, and in every state around the country. This would obviously be a huge blow to our effort to really connect people because physical connection is important, but if you can't afford it, it doesn't do you much good. On the homework gap issue, but as you indicated, during the pandemic, we put in place the Emergency Connectivity Fund. Those funds will those dedicated funds will expire at the end of this year. It was an emergency program, but we are hopeful that you will be able to adapt the E-rate program to make sure that we don't lose the ground we've gained and instead build upon that foundation. Can you talk about some of your ideas for doing that?
Sure. The E-rate program is a quiet powerhouse. Since 1996, we've been able to connect schools and libraries across the country to high-speed internet. We lead the world in our efforts to do so. And what we need to do now is update that program for the moment we're in. So I've proposed what I call Learn Without Limits, where we use the E-rate program and modernize it. For kids in rural America who spend lots of time on a school bus, we propose to use the E-rate program to develop Wi-Fi on wheels, to hook those school buses up to the school network so kids who spend time on those school buses can get some schoolwork done. I've been on buses in rural communities that have it. It's pretty dramatic. And those buses were funded by the Emergency Connectivity Fund, so we know it works. Now, the other part of Learn Without Limits is making sure every school library and library in this country has wireless hotspots to loan out. I think the E-rate program's well-suited for doing both of those things, and in the process can help us solve that homework gap you and I have talked so much about.
Thank you, and we look forward to working with you on those initiatives. Senator Hagerty.
Thank you, Chairman Van Hollen, and welcome again, Chair Rosenworcel. We've talked about national security before. I'd like to talk with you about it again today. We all know that Chinese technology is a threat, not only to the federal government, but to private industry here in America. And the FCC's covered list effectively bans the sale, bans the use, and the importation of certain communications equipment and services. I think it's a very potent tool. Mm-hmm. One of the things, and you and I've touched on this before, is it seems that the list is quite narrow. And so just as an opening question, I'd like to ask you, is the Commission being deliberately cautious here, or is there something that's holding you back?
That's a really good question, Senator. The covered list is a list of equipment that our nation's national security authorities have found to be insecure. And as a result, it cannot be used for any FCC expenditures. So if you get money from us to help you build your network, you cannot use it to purchase any of that equipment. We update it from time to time, but we only are permitted under the law to update it if national security authorities identify additional companies. And so, on a fairly regular basis, we reach out to those national security authorities enumerated in the law, like the FBI, like the Department of Justice, like the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and ask for updates. And recently, we even wrote them with the names of 2 companies that had been brought to our attention by some members of the House of Representatives and asked for their assessment on it. So if I could ask you to do one thing, it would be to make sure that those national security authorities get back to us and help us keep that list up to date.
That's a very helpful suggestion, and I think our work right here on the Appropriations Committee, we may be able to help in that regard. Staying on this, the covered list, what would be the implications of a more extensive list, even a retroactive list? How would that help you utilize the covered list to the fullest extent?
Well, the covered list has other values, too. I just want to acknowledge that when we publicly produce a list of equipment that we believe is insecure, that the government won't support, we're also telling the private sector, this isn't stuff you should be buying or using.
It's an important message.
And we are also telling the global economy that we don't trust this equipment. So I do want to acknowledge that that list has power beyond just the FCC and our immediate programs. I think it's narrow because our national security authorities are careful, which is appropriate, but I also think we can't let this list wither. We need to update it from time to time, and reaching out to them regularly as we do has been useful, but of course, you also pointing out that this should be a priority would be helpful as well.
And to amplify the point you just made, when I was serving in a previous role as United States Ambassador to Japan, the 3rd largest economy in the world, we were able to get them to block untrusted carriers because of what had happened here, our ability to point to that, and the example that we said, as you say, can have repercussions around the world. So thanks for that continuation.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct.
The strength of the covered list rests with the Commission's Equipment Authorization Program, and that predates the covered list. And my question is, if you had the Equipment Authorization Program, are there other FCC programs that are already in place that might serve as a foundation for addressing national security concerns beyond the covered list?
We've been exploring what kind of certifications might be necessary from applicants before the FCC. For instance, if you are about to bid in a spectrum auction in the future, should you certify that none of your funding comes from countries whose revenues and governments we have concerns about? We've also been exploring whether or not when we give you an authorization to participate in our economy, what kind of national security questions we should ask at the outset, including what equipments might be used in your networks and what kind of managed services you might get from some foreign provided companies. So we're looking across the board for other points to create opportunities for certification to make sure that networks in this country are secure.
Well, as you think about the national security ramifications of what you do, and I'm sure you do this every day, know that our staff stands ready to work with you, and that I would be very interested in any thoughts that you might have in terms of looking at existing authorities and new ways to utilize those, and frankly, if there's any way we can support you in that, or if you need our support, letting us know. Very quickly, I'd like to turn to the satellite industry. It's growing. It has an incredibly important role in communications. The creation of the Space Bureau is intended to align the Commission's resources with its responsibilities. And I just wanted to get an update from you what the current status of the Space Bureau is, how you're going to know if the reorganization that you're undertaking is a success, how will you measure that?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank this subcommittee for supporting this reorganization. When I got to the agency and I saw the backlog we had of satellite applications, I felt that we had to reorganize to address them more rapidly. Just this week, the agency will be voting on an effort to streamline the application process. We also have a transparency initiative. And then globally, we're leading with what I call the single network future, because we're trying to develop a framework for figuring out how terrestrial wireless services can combine with new satellite services in the phones in our pockets and the devices on the ground. So I think we're actually making great strides. The challenge now is to continue and to hire people who can help us with all the applications we have before us.
And I would think you'll find great opportunities as well for cost savings when you think about your connectivity objectives as well, utilizing this, as you called it, the single network approach. Future. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Hagerty. We've been joined by Senator Manchin, who has agreed to defer his opportunity question first to Senator Kennedy. Senator Kennedy.
Okay, thank you, Senators. Madam Chair, welcome. You've been on the FCC for a while, haven't you? You know what I'm talking about then when I refer to the C-band?
I do.
Yeah, I bet you do. That's sort of the part of the spectrum that the companies that want to roll out 5G cell phone service really need. Am I right?
It's mid-band airwaves that are like Gold Coast territory for wireless.
Right. I'm going to call them the C-band. You'll remember then in 2018, I certainly do, not you, but some of your colleagues on the FCC decided they were going to give the C-band away. My words, not yours. At the time, that C-band, we didn't know how important it was. It was licensed to some foreign satellite companies.
That's right.
And we discovered how valuable that C-band was. And the 5G telecommunication companies, mostly American companies, were really anxious to get it. And some members of the FCC, and frankly some senators, came up with a proposal to give that C-band to the foreign satellite companies and let them sell it to the 5G companies and keep the money. And I didn't like that, and neither did Senator Cantwell, and neither did Senator Schatz. And we called the president and insisted that, and the president called the FCC and said, we need to bid this out. Do you remember all that?
I do, Senator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we saved about $81 billion. Now, you've been auctioning the C-band out. You held an auction in September, did you not?
Yes,
Number 107, I think it's called.
I believe that's right.
Okay. The problem, we've got two problems here. Your authority to hold auctions has run out.
Yes.
And number two, more immediately, you conducted some auctions in September, awarded some licenses to the C-band based on auctions, highest bidder.
That's right.
took those companies' money, and then your authority ran out,
That's right.
and the FCC hadn't given them the license.
That's right.
Why can't you give them the license? They paid for it.
Oh, I agree with you. The situation's unfair. They paid for it. They deserve to have that license.
So why can't you give it to them?
So the Communications Act is very straightforward. It says our authority to grant licenses expired on March 9th of 2023. We got a lot of laws before us that are tortured and confusing, but this is a straightforward provision. It expired, and so we're going to need your help getting rid of that expiration.
What if we did two things? What if, number one, to solve the immediate problem, we passed a bill that said on a one-time, short-term basis, we're giving you, Madam Chair, and the FCC, the authority to go ahead and award those licenses that people have already paid for. That's the first bill. Second bill would be to renew your authority to hold auctions. Would you have any objection to us doing those two things?
Sure, I don't object to you trying to be specific about the licenses in your first bill, but I want to emphasize how much we do need that authority back.
All right. Tell me, I mean, this sounds very, very simple when we talk about it here. Tell me who's pushing back on reauthorizing your authority to hold auctions.
Well, that's happening in Congress. I certainly have uniform support among my colleagues at the FCC for getting auction authority.
Who's against it?
It's
I'm not asking personalities. I'm asking what interest groups are against it.
Well, you know, the way that we auction spectrum and have in the last several years, the C-band being an exception, is we frequently identify airwaves with federal users from the Department of Defense or the Department of Transportation. And we say perhaps they could do the same function with a little less spectrum. And then we identify a way to take some of that spectrum, repurpose it for new commercial use. And then with the revenues from our auctions, we make the Defense Department or the Department of Transportation whole by giving them funds from the auction.
So you're getting pushback from the Defense Department and the Department of Transportation.
Well, those are the two largest federal authorities with airwaves below 6 gigahertz. So I focused on them here. But the reality is we are putting more stuff in our skies for communication than ever before.
But you can't say this, but I can. You're getting pushback from defense and transportation. We've got a turf battle here. What can we do to sit down with DOD and transportation and the FCC and work this out? We are all for national defense.
Absolutely.
We're also for 5G. So what can we do to get this worked out?
Well, I could offer the services of my office and my whole agency to assist you, because I want to make clear that when our commercial wireless economy grows, technology expands, and the U.S. does better. That's true.
Well, if our chairman called a meeting
board.
and tried to get everybody together, would you come to it?
I would.
And would you bring your colleagues from the
would.
FCC?
Absolutely.
Okay, we need to get this battle worked out.
I agree with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Kennedy, before I turn it over to Senator Manchin, I say amen to everything you said, both in terms of making sure that those companies that have already paid for their spectrum should get it, but they could also get that if we just reauthorize the authority to enter into these contracts. I talked to Senator Cantwell about this issue today, who chairs the Senate Commerce Committee with authorizing jurisdiction. Not a long conversation, but I agree with you. We need to get this done in the coming weeks because it's hurting all of us. Thank you. Senator Manchin.
I also agree. Let me just say this. The fiscal year 21 omnibus bill appropriated $1.9 billion to carry out the Secured and Trusted Communications Networks reimbursements program, which is also known as a rip and replace program.
Yes.
For all the people that we say are out there that we got to get them off those services. Where do you stand on that? What are then some security implications that we're not fully aware of?
Well, there's insecure Chinese equipment in many of our nation's smallest wireless carriers. And Congress provided us with $1.9 billion to take it out so they could replace it.
Right.
But as I've told the authorizing committees, we need an additional $3.08 billion to fully take that equipment out.
We're
and
paying for
securely
all of it. The
replace
federal government's paying to reimburse those who were led to believe this is safe and secure, and it's cheaper.
That's exactly right. I think we've decided that this equipment is insecure, and
into
we
your-
need to take it out at all costs. And the smallest carriers have it in their networks with the least resources and the fewest customers. So Congress set aside funding
Madam
for it.
Chairwoman, then talk to me about your FCC's budget for 24.
Yeah, our budget
Is
maintains.
it in there? Is your request in there?
Our request is not part of our budget because it was part. I think that funding was set aside in a defense authorization bill.
The reason I'm saying that, everything we're talking about is extremely important. That was one of the most offensive things that we had found out about, all the different users that we had using something that could be detrimental to all of us and our security.
Yeah.
So to me, that would be a high priority. That I think if you don't identify it, I can guarantee you, they won't come forward and just say, oh, yeah, we still think that's needed, but it must not be your highest priority because it's not in your budget request.
Well, I've written to members of Congress on this on 5 or 6 different separate occasions asking to be able to have this funding made available. So we have made it a priority, and we're working with the carriers that have it in their networks right now to try to identify a way
What's your
forward.
highest priorities right now within your budget request as far as the mission of the FCC?
I think we've got to make sure that we figure out a way to get broadband to everyone in this country. We've got to make sure that our maps can actually be accurate and help with that process. We've got to make sure that wireless services reach everyone and that we get our spectrum authorities back.
How do you, in rural areas such as mine and Louisiana and Tennessee and on and on and on, Maryland even has some rural areas that I'm very familiar with. How do we make sure that the carriers who have exclusive rights in those areas, who've had rights and have told us everything and the maps have been totally erroneous, or maps and they protect their territory, how can we make sure that they're doing what's needed? I had a person call me today, 1/2 mile from where Frontier was going, 8 homes down over, and they won't come.
Yeah. No, we
How-
hear
how do
stories
we-
like that all the time. What we are trying to do with our maps, and this is a process, it's not something that happens overnight, is we build the kind of database where consumers, states, and municipalities can come to us and say, this information's not right. I live here, and in my own backyard, let me tell you, you've got it wrong, or what the carriers are telling you isn't right. And I think you know we've been working with the West Virginia Broadband Office to do a lot of that work, and a lot of state broadband offices have really stepped up to help us understand where our data's right and where it's wrong. And I just got to tell you, we're going to have to commit to that process for the long haul to make sure that things like those BEAD monies that are being spent right now get spent in the right places.
Are you able to have enough resources to do the mapping and making sure the maps are accurate and followed as we designed?
We do right now, but in the next fiscal year, we'll have to ask for an additional appropriation to keep those maps up and running and continue to improve them.
My recommendation would be, based on what we talked with the Huawei's and all the concerns we had that we just mentioned, that be a high priority of yours to ask in your budget, and
Yes.
also for the additional on this, because just in common sense, I tell people back home, and they remember their grandparents or great-grandparents talking about, and they had no electricity. In 1936, we had rural broadband electrification. I could never figure how we got into so many hollows and up so many creeks and everything else. I never could figure it out. And then I heard about co-ops.
Yeah.
And it was people who didn't basically look at anything except the service they needed. And they gathered as a co-op and was able to take it at the lowest cost. Is that type of a model still available for broadband when we can't get the big guys to go because they say, well, there's no return on investment. So why are you forcing me to go up this hollow or down this road here and there's only 5 people?
I think we have a perfect analog with the Rural Electrification Act. I mean, there was a time where we thought we could only bring electricity to the cities. You weren't going to turn the lights on in
There's not
parts
that
of
many
rural West
co-ops still
Virginia.
left. There's not that many rural co-ops still left.
And what we did was we mapped where electricity was and was not, and then we identified where commercial actors could take it, and where commercial actors wouldn't take it, we developed public-private partnerships to deploy in those communities.
So we can identify some areas ourselves where they just cannot get service. I mean, I'm sure that all of us here have that same problem. And if we can identify that to where you will assist and help them put collective together.
Absolutely. What you have to be mindful of is some state laws prevent some of those municipal deployments, and you need to make sure that the state legislature does not stop those activities from happening. But, you know, history shows that when we didn't have barns or roads or bridges, we came together as communities to build them.
Sure.
This, to me, feels exactly the same.
Well, we got one shot because we put a lot of money at it right now, and if we don't follow through, we'll not have it.
You're right. The BEAD program is a once-in-a-lifetime kind of effort.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Manchin, and as Chair Rosenworcel said, in some of these areas, and because we've had conversations in Western Maryland, in some of the areas there's been local resistance to allowing a municipality, for example, to simply start their own broadband service if there's no other provider, and some state laws preempt it. But I look forward to working with you on that. Let me just say, with respect to rip and replace, right, this was our effort to improve the security of our own networks. There were a number of networks around the country that had ZTE and Huawei part of it. As part of the 21 omnibus, we collectively, Congress, provided $1.9 billion in mandatory funding to rip and replace those funds. So it's never been part of the baseline. It was considered a one-time expenditure. It was not enough. So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Madam Chairwoman, is that it requires another approximately $3 billion to finish the job. Is that right?
That's correct.
And we're hoping that that might be included as part of an effort to extend your authority when it comes to sales, leasing of the spectrum.
That's right.
Mr. Chairman, can I just
Yeah.
follow up on that? Is that only for domestic?
Yes.
Rip and replace is just for domestic,
Just for carriers in the United States.
United States, because we have an awful lot of our allies who
Abs-
really fall in trap.
Absolutely, but only carriers in the United States.
I got you.
Let me turn quickly to the question of robocalls, and we're obviously going to do another round of questions for any members who are interested. Robocalls is obviously a constant challenge for consumers, and it's always a bit of a cat and mouse game, trying to keep one step ahead of the robocallers who are violating the law. So if you could speak to two things. One, the challenge of collecting fines that have been leveled against violators, and whether we can be helpful in any way or whether they're sort of fly-by-night operations. The second, as you mentioned in your testimony, the need for Congress to help you fill a loophole in the law. My understanding is there's been a recent lawsuit, and maybe current law does not cover texting. So if you could cover those two issues.
Sure. Robocalls are annoying. Robotexts are irritating. We need to do everything we can to stop them. We've deployed new technology like STIR/SHAKEN. We've got a traceback consortium working on it. I've now got partnerships with 47 of our state attorneys general to work with them on this issue. We've issued cease and desist letters. We're doing new things, new tools, but there are two gaping loopholes that I see. The first is a Supreme Court decision in 2021 decided to freeze the definition of auto dialer in the early 90s. And as a result, there are a whole lot of scam artists out there who can evade our authority in the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. We'd like to update that definition so that we can enforce the law against them. And second, we've issued more than $700 million in fines against robocallers and robotexters since I've been at the helm of the agency. But I can't take them to court and go collect that money. I have to hand that off to the Department of Justice. And I'm sure they've got lots of other priorities, and I'm sure many of those companies are fly-by-night, and collecting those fines may not be easy, but I still would like the authority to do it because I have to do everything we can to hold those folks to account if we want this effort at enforcement to be successful.
Well, speaking for myself, I'd like to help you on both counts there. And maybe we can work with your team. The second part, which is giving the FCC the authority to directly go to court to collect the fees, do you have any estimate of what that would require in terms of additional resources?
I suspect the consent of the Department of Justice, and that might prove more challenging than identifying the resources. But I just feel like we got to hold some of these folks accountable, and issuing fines and letting them disappear is not the way to do it.
Absolutely, but as you know, there are other federal agencies that do have the authority to bring lawsuits, and they develop sort of shared authorities
Right.
With the Department of Justice. So if,
Yeah, and
if
we're
they don't have
working-
the time or capacity
Right.
to do this, maybe we should talk to them about it.
And we've been working with state attorneys general. We've had a lot of success working with the Ohio Attorney General on auto warranty scams. We've done some mortgage scams with the Florida Attorney General. really, no matter where you are in this country, people are irritated by this. So we are trying to develop as many partnerships as we can to make sure these folks are held to account.
Got it. And my last question really picks up on something that Senator Manchin raised, and which I raised, all of us have raised, which is the mapping question. And as I said in my opening remarks, I think the FCC has made dramatic strides in improving the system by creating that feedback loop. But I'm sure you're aware of the 2022 GAO report that talked about the 15 federal agencies administering broadband programs. Now, the BEAD program is obviously a big one in the Department of Commerce, but there are many others. Can you discuss the effort at coordination? Because I can tell you, in preparing for this hearing, in fact, one of the reasons we wanted to have the hearing was just as we sort of look through the chart of, Department of Agriculture, FCC, Commerce, all of these agencies that are involved. If you were going to recreate this, you have any thoughts on how we design it or how we can better coordinate with the existing programs?
Senator, if I had a magic wand, I would make it simpler. I understand what you're describing. So what I've been trying to do at the agency is figure out how we can coordinate with as many of these actors as possible. I signed a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Commerce because they have a lot of programs like BEAD. And I signed a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Agriculture because the Rural Utilities Service has a lot of programs. I also went to the Department of the Treasury because their Capital Projects Fund is loaning out a lot of money. So I went to the biggest actors and said, we're all going to share information and data. On top of that, I've developed something called the Broadband Funding Map. It's not the map that gets all the attention, but I think going forward it should get more attention. Because I'm asking everyone who has a broadband program to file data with us about where they've given out grants, so that we have a map of the enforceable commitments around the country. To be clear, I've had a lot of positive feedback from the Department of Commerce. We coordinate well. I got to work with some of the other agencies, get more information and more data from them, but it's starting to come in. And keeping these other agencies reporting to us about where their grants are going, where their dollars are headed and what they're doing is a really important part of making sure that we don't overfund some areas and ignore others. And so that broadband funding map, I think, is a very important tool for Congress and its oversight, but I'm going to need all those other agencies to give me their data in a very specific format in order to ensure that tool is really valuable.
Well, if you can keep us posted, I'm sure we have a shared interest in making sure you get full cooperation from the other agencies, because, as you said, one thing it's important to have a map to know who has broadband connections and who doesn't. It is also important to have a map of who's funding what where, so we don't duplicate effort. Senator Hagerty.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion, Mr. Chair, and I certainly applaud your asking the question, and Chair Rosenworcel, I hope you'll share even the interim data on this broadband funding map with our teams. I'd very much like to see just the data to date and what it's showing you, what it's telling you, where it might lead us as policymakers and appropriators. I'd like to just come back to the topic of our allies for a moment. And I think you're working hard, you're working at pace. You've even identified the cost at $3.08 billion of what it will take you to rip and replace here and try to get our networks secure. I think it's terribly important that we do it. I think it's also important that our allies do the same. And one of the most important aspects of our alliances around the world is our interoperability with our allies. That is constrained dramatically when we have systems that we can't trust on the other side. And I have seen a real gap, if you will, in terms of understanding amongst our allies of what the threats are, what the concerns might be. And I'm not certain what the vehicle would be, and it might take you a little longer than just this moment to think it through. But if there's a role that you could play in terms of putting together the information that would help persuade our allies of the urgency of doing exactly what you're trying to accomplish here in terms of getting their networks secure so that we can share more information with them and so that we will be more interoperable with them, I think you do us a great service. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, and I've talked to national security authorities about this. I think that if we choose to take this equipment out of our networks and fully fund its replacement costs, we have to go tell everyone around the world that we chose to do that. The United States decided that this equipment was so insecure, we needed to take it out, remove it, and we paid for it. I think that's a really powerful example, And when we do it, we need to share that with our allies around the world. And there are other countries that are working with us on this issue, not all of them, but I think it is also simultaneously important that we help build up a better market for network equipment in the United States and in our allies, because we've gotten to a place where there's only a handful of network equipment providers in the world right now. Some of the biggest come from China. We need to make sure that the equipment market is more diverse and more competitive and less costly. I think that will also benefit us and our political interest in making sure that secure equipment is here at home and also abroad.
Back in 2017, I asked for a chart that showed what an end-to-end non-China solution for 5G would look like. And we actually put flags on the chart. Multiple nations are involved for us to get this done, and multiple opportunities, therefore, to cooperate and the need to cooperate with those nations in terms of their standards, the specs for those devices. There's a big opportunity and a big challenge at the same time.
Yeah, we can't do this on our own. We've got to find like-minded nations and then work with others to make sure that this equipment, which isn't just about communications networks, it's about the infrastructure that supports modern economies, is actually secure and not vulnerable to foreign actors who might eventually wish to do them harm.
Yeah, no, I think the vulnerability is clear, and I very much appreciate your continued thinking on this. And if you see an opportunity for us to help support you in this effort, please know that we're all supportive of doing that. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Well, Chair Rosenworcel, we've covered a lot of territory today. Thank you, Senator Hagerty, other members who were here. The hearing record will remain open for 7 days, allowing members to submit statements and/or questions for the record, which should be sent to the subcommittee by close of business Tuesday, September 25th, 2023. And with that, this committee hearing is adjourned.